I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. For those of you who listened to Professor Levitsky last night, you know you're going to be in for a treat today as well. Before I introduce him and the topic, I want to remind you of a couple of our other upcoming events. On Monday, November 21st at noon here in the Foley Institute, we have Craig Parsons from the University of Oregon and Todd Butler from here at WSU. They're going to be talking about Brexit and the Brexit process. So if you're interested in that, that should be a good conversation. Then on Thursday, October 24th at noon here in the Foley Institute, we have John Peedy, who's the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's going to be talking about the celebrating the 220th anniversary of the American Constitution. So that should be a good discussion as well. Today's topic is going to examine right-wing populism in Latin America. And we have probably the best person that we can find to talk about that issue. Steven Levitsky is a professor of government at Harvard University and the chair of Harvard's Weatherhead Research Center, or cluster, on challenges to democracy. His research interests include political parties, authoritarianism and democratization, populism, and weak and informal institutions, with a focus on the United States and Latin America. He's the author of many books and articles. His most recent book with Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, was an international bestseller and the winner of the Goldsmith Book Prize for Improving Democratic Governance. I strongly encourage, if you haven't had an opportunity to pick this book up and read it, it's a terrific read. And this will form the basis for some of his comments today, I assume. Join me now in welcoming Steven Levitsky.
Thank you very much. So I was just presented with a gift of a big can of cat food. It's not cat food?
Not cat food. Not spam either.
Okay. Didn't it say cougar cat food? I didn't have time to look at it very closely. Thank you for bringing me here. It's been wonderful. Nobody told me about the freaking snow, but beyond that, I tried huckleberry stuff for the first time in my life. It's been a great visit. One comment before I jump into the talk, which is that when I use the term liberalism in this talk, or illiberalism, I'm not talking about liberalism as we use the term in the United States. I'm not talking about Tom Foley liberalism. When I talk about liberalism, it is what in the United States we usually refer to as libertarianism. It's a commitment to free markets and a commitment to individual rights. And so illiberals, I'm going to talk a lot about the illiberal right in Latin America. Illiberals are those who devalue and sometimes attack individual rights. So just to clarify. So I was asked to talk, as Cornell mentioned, about the rise of right-wing populism in Latin America. I'm not sure that we're seeing a rise of right-wing populism in Latin America. In Latin America, we usually define populism as the mobilization of lower-class constituencies, usually by a personalistic outsider, against the entire political and economic elite. So at its core, populism is anti-elite. Populists tell voters that the entire establishment, from left-wing intellectuals to right-wing businessmen, the entire establishment is corrupt and undemocratic. And they promise to sweep that establishment away in the name of some more authentic democracy. That's Perón, it's Hugo Chavez, it's Alberto Fujimori in Peru, it's probably Trump in the United States. But recently, if you read the newspapers, if you listen to a lot of people, we've been applying the term populism to, I think, a much broader range of phenomena. Things like nativism, authoritarianism, and other forms of illiberalism. We're basically using the term populism to characterize all illiberal politicians we don't like. Authoritarian types like Putin and Orban, thuggish law and order types like Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, ethnic nationalists like Modi in India, Brexiteers and anti-immigrant parties in Europe. The only thing that unites all those characters is illiberalism. We are conflating populism with illiberalism. So I think it's more accurate to speak about the rise of an illiberal right in Latin America than it is to talk about the rise of a populist right. So I'm going to use the term illiberal right. So is there a turn to the illiberal right? To answer that question, I want to spend a few minutes looking back at Latin America's so-called left turn, or pink tide, in the early part of the 21st century. As I'm sure all of you know, between 1998 and 2009, the left won the presidency in Venezuela, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and El Salvador. This was a stunning turn to the left. It surpassed anything ever seen before in Latin America. For more than a decade, for about 10, 12 years, the Latin American left did nothing but win. It was re-elected once in Chile and El Salvador. It was re-elected twice in Argentina and Uruguay and Bolivia, twice in Ecuador, 3 times in Brazil, 4 times in Venezuela. Why did that happen? Quickly, 2 long-term causes underlie the turn to the left in Latin America. Poverty and inequality on the one hand, and democracy on the other. Poverty and inequality create a natural constituency for the left. They create a bigger pool of voters who will be receptive to parties that promise redistribution. But the other condition, the crucial condition, because Latin America has long had poverty and inequality, that is not new. What was new in the last 30 years in Latin America was democracy. For most of Latin American history, left-wing parties could not legally contest for power because they were banned or repressed. And when the left won power, it was almost invariably toppled by military coups. Venezuela in 1948, Guatemala in 1954, Dominican Republic in 1963, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973. That pattern changed with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. Now, for the first time ever, the left can legally compete for power everywhere in Latin America except Cuba, paradoxically enough. And military coups have virtually disappeared, which means that the left not only can come to power, but it can govern. So poverty and inequality created a constituency for the left, and democracy gave the left a real chance to compete for power and to govern. Those 2 conditions made the left turn possible. But to explain the timing of the left turn, why it happened in the early part of the 21st century, we have to look at economic conditions. Now, many people view the rise of the left in Latin America as a backlash against neoliberalism, against free market policies. According to this view, Latin Americans turned to the left as a reaction to the free market reforms of the 1990s. Neoliberalism imposed costs on the poor, generating broad popular backlash, which pushed voters to the left. But the evidence of this backlash against neoliberalism theory is not very good. The left won in a few cases of radical neoliberal reform, like Chile and Argentina, but it also won in places where neoliberal reform was pretty limited, almost non-existent, like Ecuador and Venezuela. And moreover, public opinion surveys during this time showed very little turn to the left, did not show that voters were turning leftward. So it's not clear, or there's very little evidence that voters were rejecting neoliberalism per se. Arguably, what triggered the wave of left-wing victories in the early 2000s was the economic crisis of the late 1990s. Beginning in 1998, economies tanked across Latin America. For 5 years, the region stagnated. Per capita GDP declined by 2% across the region on average between 1997 and 2002. Levels of poverty, levels of inequality increased across the region. That economic crisis between 1998 and 2002 did 2 things. First of all, it did what it does in all democracies. It hurt incumbents. When incumbents don't perform well, voters tend to throw them out in favor of the opposition. Incumbents did not perform well between 1998 and 2002, so they lost. Between 1998 and 2004, incumbent parties lost the presidency in 14 out of 18 Latin American democracies. Who were those incumbents? Well, they were mostly center or center-right governments that had embraced the free market reforms of the 1990s, that had embraced the Washington Consensus of the 1990s. Who was in opposition at this time? In many, many cases, it was the left. So the left benefited electorally from the economic crisis of the late 1990s. Second thing that the crisis did, though, was erode public support for neoliberalism. By 2004, after about 5 years of this crisis, more than 70% of survey respondents across Latin America said they were dissatisfied with the performance of the market economy. So not only did the economic crisis turn Latin American voters against incumbents, but it also turned them against neoliberals. That meant that Latin American voters were inclined not just to the opposition, but toward opposition candidates who promised some sort of alternative to neoliberalism. Now, beginning in 2002, with the left beginning to come to power, economic conditions helped the left in a second way, by giving governments money to spend. The debt crisis of the 1980s had left Latin American governments across the region, without exception, with very little room to maneuver the 1980s and the 1990s. Governments across Latin America were essentially bankrupt, which meant they were forced to accept the policy prescriptions, free market policy prescriptions imposed by the IMF. Very few governments in Latin America in the 1980s and the 1990s had the wherewithal to challenge the Washington consensus. And as a result, even left-wing parties, even populist parties, long-standing populist parties like Peronism in Argentina, governed on the right. But beginning in 2002, Latin America experienced an extraordinary commodities boom. Thanks to soaring demand, mostly from China, the price of Latin American commodity exports skyrocketed. Between the year 2000 and the year 2010, the price of soybeans, a major export of Argentina and Brazil, doubled. The price of copper, a major Chilean export, more than quadrupled. The price of gold, a major Peruvian export, more than quintupled. And the price of oil and natural gas, major exports of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, increased sixfold. So thanks to the commodities boom, thanks to demand from China, Latin American exports soared. Between 2000 and 2012, Argentine exports tripled. Brazilian exports quadrupled. Peruvian and Venezuelan exports nearly quintupled. That export boom in the first decade of the 21st century did several important things. First of all, it generated economic growth. Latin American economies grew at nearly 5% a year between 2003 and 2011. That's the highest sustained growth rate in decades in Latin America. And crucially, the export boom provided Latin American governments with the resources to actually govern on the left. So instead of running trade and current accounts deficits, as they had for decades, Latin American governments suddenly, in the early 21st century, had big surpluses. That meant for the first time in decades, in half a century in some countries, governments actually had money in the treasury. They had money to spend. That allowed governments, among other things, to dramatically increase social spending. And it transformed Latin American governments' relationship with the international financial community. Brazil and Argentina paid off their entire debt to the IMF. They just said, we're done with you. Even Bolivia, a tiny, highly dependent country, could afford to thumb its nose at the IMF. So suddenly, Latin American governments had much more room to maneuver than they had in the 1980s and 90s. That opened up space to experiment with left-of-center policies. Is that more or less clear? So starting in 1998, an economic crisis led Latin American voters to throw out right-of-center incumbents in favor of candidates who promised an alternative to neoliberalism. And after 2002, a commodities boom provided left governments with the resources to do things they couldn't have dreamed of doing a decade earlier. Now, I'm supposed to talk about the right. Over the last 5 years, the pink tide has begun to ebb. The beginning of the end of the left turn was not very democratic. We kind of forget this. In Honduras, populist President Manuel Zelaya was overthrown in a military coup in 2009. That's how the left turn ended in Honduras. In Paraguay, Fernando Lugo, left-wing priest, was impeached in 2012 in a 2-day process that has been described as a show trial. Again, not terribly democratic. And in Brazil in 2016, Dilma Rousseff of the PT was removed in a highly politicized impeachment. But since 2015, over the last 4 or 5 years, the left has actually started to legitimately lose elections. In Argentina, the Peronists were defeated by Buenos Aires Mayor Mauricio Macri in 2015. In Chile, the governing center-left coalition was defeated by Sebastián Piñera in 2017. In Brazil, the PT tried to come back after its impeachment and was crushed by Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. And in El Salvador, the FMLN lost to outsider candidate Nayib Bukele. So why is the left turn coming to an end? Mostly for the same reason it began, the economy. The left turn, again, began in the wake of the late 1990s economic crisis, which eroded support for center-right governments. It was sustained for more than a decade because of the commodities boom. And it came to an end now. It's coming to an end now because the commodities boom has largely come to an end. So after growing nearly 5% a year between 2003 and 2011, Latin American economies were pretty stagnant, pretty much at zero, between 2015 and 2018. And in some countries, like Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, it was much worse than that. Economies plunged into recession. When times are bad, voters throw out the incumbents. When times were bad in the late 1990s, most incumbents were on the right, so that brought us the left turn. But now incumbents are mostly on the left, and the left is starting to lose. That's the main reason why the left is losing power. Another reason, though, that's important is corruption. The commodities boom allowed the left to stay in power for a long time. 3 terms in Argentina, Uruguay, Nicaragua, Ecuador. 3.5 terms in Brazil. 4 terms in Bolivia. I've stopped counting in Venezuela. So we're talking about 12, 14, 15 years in power without a break. In a middle-income country with a weak state bureaucracy, 14 or 15 years uninterrupted in power is very likely to lead to abuse of power and to at least a medium level of corruption. Governments grow lazy, unresponsive, corrupt. And that clearly happened, for example, in Argentina, in Brazil, to some extent in El Salvador, certainly in Venezuela. Now, in a democracy, voters can remove governments that get drunk on power. And in Argentina, in Brazil, to some extent Chile and El Salvador, that's exactly what voters did. Unfortunately, Venezuelan voters no longer have that option. So the left has begun to lose for pretty simple reasons. Economies have slowed down and corruption scandals have begun to add up. Now initially, if you go back 4 or 5 years and read The Economist magazine, the decline of the left was interpreted as a victory for and a return to market liberalism. Newly elected President Sebastián Piñera in Chile, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, or PPK, in Peru, Mauricio Macri in Argentina. These guys were center-right liberals. They were moderate politicians who were committed to both free markets and democracy. International observers were thrilled, they were overjoyed. They immediately began to pen articles about how Latin Americans had woken up from their populist hangover and were turning back to responsible, market-oriented leaders. The Economist declared, as it always does, that populism is in retreat across Latin America and implied that we were heading back to the sort of Washington Consensus 1990s. But there was no center-right wave. Macri, Kuczynski, and Piñera turned out to be the only moderate center-right figures elected in the region. In Bolivia, in Costa Rica, in Ecuador, maybe in Uruguay, the left was reelected. Mexicans and Panamanians turned from the center-right to the center-left. In El Salvador, voters threw out the leftist FMLN, but instead of voting for the right-wing Arena, they chose a populist outsider. And in Brazil and in Colombia, moderate center-right candidates, the kind of the guys that the Economist magazine likes, were badly defeated by extreme right-wing candidates. So not too many victories by the moderate center-right. And what's more, the moderate center-right politicians who everybody raved about 5 years ago have mostly been an utter disaster. In Peru, Kuczynski lasted for 2 years before he was forced to resign in a corruption scandal. In Argentina, Macri failed to turn the economy around and is about to lose big in a couple of weeks in presidential elections. That leaves only Piñera in Chile, and he's sort of limping along with, I think, a 34% approval rating. So there hasn't been very much of a right turn in Latin America. If you look at the 8 biggest countries in Latin America, 2 of 8 are governed by the left, Mexico and Venezuela. 2 of 8 governments are sort of center, maybe vaguely center-left, Peru and Ecuador. 2 of 8 governments are extreme right, Colombia and Brazil. And 2 of 8 governments are center-right, Chile and Argentina, although Argentina is about to turn back to the center-left. So after Argentina's election in a couple of weeks, it's likely to be 3 left-wing governments, 3 right-wing governments, and 2 centrist governments. So the dominant pattern of the last 5 years is less a turn to the right than it is a turn against incumbents. Economic growth has slowed, crime and corruption seem to be on the rise, so incumbent parties are losing support and incumbent parties are losing elections. That is the dominant pattern. Where unpopular, unsuccessful governments are on the left, like in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, El Salvador, you see a turn to the center or the right. When unpopular incumbents are on the right, like in Mexico, Panama, probably Argentina later this month, you see a turn back to the left. So not a clear right-wing turn. But we are seeing a right turn of sorts in Latin America, which I want to spend the rest of my talk on. And that is a turn from the liberal right to a more illiberal right. During the 1990s and the early 2000s, the most influential parties on the Latin American right were broadly liberal, in that they supported free markets, but they also broadly embraced democracy, human rights, basic civil rights. This is the PAN in Mexico, it's the Social Democrats, the PSDB in Brazil, National Renovation in Chile, the Colorados and the Blancos in Uruguay, the Liberals in Colombia, the National Advancement Party in Guatemala, Social Christians in Peru and in Costa Rica, and eventually Arena in El Salvador, the UDI in Chile. For these parties, for all the parties I just mentioned, the priority in the 90s and early 2000s, overwhelming priority was free market reform. Social and cultural issues, things like crime and abortion and gay rights, were really very secondary. They were not important to the dominant right-of-center parties in Latin America in the 90s and early 2000s. These parties, the center-right, achieved a lot of what it wanted to achieve policy-wise in the 1990s. They were the big winners because free market reforms were adopted across Latin America. So the center-right was triumphant in the 1990s. But in electoral terms, most liberal right parties failed to build broad or sustainable electoral coalitions. And as a result, many of them are losing ground today and being challenged and in many countries overtaken by a more extreme illiberal right. Now, by illiberal right, I mean parties that devalue and even attack individual rights, especially minority rights. The illiberal right in Latin America has two broad wings. It has a security wing and it has a religious wing. Guns and God. The security wing, the guns wing, champions public security, champions fighting crime and delinquency over the protection of rights. It promises to take a strong hand, so-called mano dura, against criminals and, in many countries, leftist subversives, even if that means violating international norms, even if that means violating legal niceties like due process, equality before the law, presumption of innocence. In other words, when faced with a trade-off between public security, protecting people, and protecting their rights, the illiberal right chooses the former, chooses security over rights. It seeks to unleash the police, the army, and wage war on the bad guys, even if that means violating the rights of suspected criminals, even if it means disproportionately victimizing poor and non-white citizens, and in some cases, even if it means embracing paramilitary militias, extrajudicial killing, and torture. Some of these folks, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, openly praise past military dictatorships, treating them as models for how to provide order and security. And they dismiss human rights, quite literally, as a Marxist invention. That's the guns wing. The religious wing focuses on the defense of traditional values against the expansion of secularism, women's rights, and especially gay rights. They've mobilized in particular around issues of gay marriage, abortion, and sexual education. So here the emphasis is on preserving traditional societal values, even if that means restricting the rights of non-traditional minorities, homosexuals, unwed pregnant women, for example. Now, the security wing and the religious wing are not necessarily natural allies. They're pretty different. They have different goals. They have different ideologies. But in practice, they've often worked together politically. You see this in Fujimorismo in Peru. You see it in Uribismo in Colombia. You see it with Bolsonaro in Brazil. Each of these movements is backed by both the security wing and the Christian wing. The illiberal right, and this is the sense in which we are seeing a right turn in Latin America, the illiberal right has begun to eclipse the liberal right in many important Latin American countries. The most prominent is Brazil. For 25 years, Brazil's dominant right-of-center party was Fernando Henrique Cardoso's Social Democratic Party. That was basically a centrist, mildly center-right party that combined free market economics with secularism and social liberalism. Basically libertarian. But the PSDB collapsed in 2018. It won just 5% of the vote. Much of the right-wing vote was captured by Jair Bolsonaro, an openly authoritarian, racist, misogynistic, homophobic candidate. Bolsonaro very explicitly appealed to both the guns wing and the God wing. He embraced torture, he embraced death squads, he suggested that he would strip away the rights of leftists, of homosexuals, of indigenous people. In Colombia, the liberal right, which was represented in the early part of the 21st century by the Santos government, has been defeated politically by Uribismo, the followers of former President Álvaro Uribe. The Uribistas, followers of Uribe, are hardline security types. They're associated with paramilitary groups responsible for killing hundreds of leftists, union leaders, and human rights activists, particularly in the early part of the 2000s. In 2016, the Uribistas teamed up with evangelical Christians to oppose the Santos government's peace accord with the left-wing FARC guerrillas. And they managed to defeat the peace accord in a referendum in 2016. In 2018, this same coalition of Uribistas and Christians backed Uribista candidate Iván Duque, who won the presidency, crushing Santos's candidate, who won just 7% of the vote. In Peru, the liberal right has been pretty weak for a while, but in 2016, it kind of accidentally managed to win the presidency for reasons that are not worth getting into. But the winner of the 2016 presidential election, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, was very much a representative of the liberal right. Unfortunately, PPK was eaten alive by Fujimorismo, the party of the illiberal right. Like Uribismo, Fujimorismo comes from the guns wing of the illiberal right. Their leader, former President Alberto Fujimori, defeated the Shining Path insurgency during the 1990s, but he also engaged in pretty serious human rights violations, which among other things landed him in prison where he is today. Now, led by Fujimori's daughter, Keiko, who's actually also in prison today, or jail, Fujimorismo aligned very explicitly with evangelical Christians with other conservative forces and won an outright majority in Congress in 2016. That majority in Congress made life hell for Kuczynski, and he resigned under the threat of impeachment in 2018. Fujimorismo, though it has some problems right now, including the fact that its leader is in jail, is now the dominant force among the Peruvian right. It has the support of much of business, has the support of evangelicals, and many conservative Catholics. It is the dominant force on the Peruvian right. In Costa Rica, somewhat surprisingly, the moderate right for decades was represented by the Social Christian Unity Party, which despite its name was basically pretty liberal. But the Social Christians fell to fourth place in the 2018 presidential election. They were overtaken by Fabricio Alvarado, an evangelical Christian musician, an outsider, who basically ran a single-issue campaign in opposition to gay marriage. Alvarado finished second in the 2018 election. He was defeated in the runoff by another guy named Alvarado, but who was less evangelical. In Chile, interestingly, the liberal right is now is increasingly represented by a guy named Jose Antonio Cast, who recently broke with the established right and created a far right-wing party called Republican Action. Cast is positioning himself to run for president in 2021, and he clearly is positioning to do it in a sort of a Bolsonaro-like platform. He's embraced Bolsonaro quite openly. He has defended Pinochet's human rights record. He's come out very strongly against gay rights and against immigration, which has become a pretty big issue in Chile. Now, the illiberal right is not ascendant everywhere. So far, it has not made serious inroads in Argentina, not made serious inroads in Uruguay or in Mexico. But it's clear that the illiberal right is on the rise across much of Latin America, and that the liberal or moderate right is in retreat. So why is this happening? Why are we seeing the emergence of an illiberal right? One of the main reasons is violent crime. Throughout history, in regions across the world, fear and insecurity have pushed citizens to the right. They helped to foster fascism in Europe, bureaucratic authoritarianism in South America, genocidal dictatorships in El Salvador and Guatemala in the early 1980s. Violence and insecurity breed fear, and fear leads people very often to embrace leaders who promise a strong hand. We saw that with the rise of populism in Peru during the 1990s. We saw it with the success of uribismo in Colombia in the early 2000s. In both of those countries, voters feared mounting left-wing insurgencies and turned to illiberal right leaders. Today, the problem isn't so much left-wing insurgencies as it is violent crime. Violent crime rates in Latin America are the highest in the world, by far. In Britain and in Spain, there is an average of about 1 homicide per 100,000 people per year. 1 per 100,000 per year. In Canada, there's an average of 2 homicides per 100,000 per year. In the United States, which is the most violent country among industrialized countries by far, there were 4 homicides per 100,000 last year. In Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, there were 25 homicides per 100,000 last year. In Honduras, there were 40 homicides per 100,000. In El Salvador, there were 51 homicides per 100,000. In Venezuela, there were 81 homicides per 100,000 in 2018. That's 20 times the rate of the United States. It's 80 times the rate of Spain and the UK. Rising crime rates have generated widespread public frustration and widespread public discontent, which means there is a ready-made constituency for a politician who promises to sweep aside legal niceties and apply a mano dura to get the criminals. That's what Fujimori and Uribe did successfully in Peru and Colombia. It's what Duterte has done so successfully in the Philippines. That is essentially the model. Promise bullets for the bad guys and you win votes. The model is Duterte in Philippines. And again, this is not an invented problem. This is a real problem. Latin America's homicide rate is nearly 5 times that of the United States. It's 30 times higher than Europe. Of the 20 most violent countries on earth, 17 of them are in Latin America. So that's one reason why we're seeing the rise in the illiberal right. The other is the rise of evangelical Christianity. Pentecostalism has been on the rise for decades in Latin America. Between 1960 and 1990, the number of evangelical Christians doubled in Chile, Paraguay, and Venezuela. The number of evangelicals tripled in Nicaragua, Argentina, Dominican Republic, quadrupled in Brazil, quintupled in El Salvador, Peru, and Colombia, and increased 7-fold in Guatemala. Today, 40% of Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Nicaraguans call themselves Protestant. Around 35% of Salvadorans, about 25% of Chileans, Brazilians, and Costa Ricans call themselves Protestant. Now, during the 20th century, the vast majority of evangelicals laid low politically. They kept very quiet politically because they were fearful of the power of the Catholic Church. But in the early 21st century, the last couple of decades, evangelicals have begun to flex their political muscle, in part because the Catholic Church keeps weakening. So, evangelicals have jumped into politics in Central America, they've jumped into politics in Brazil, they've jumped into politics now in Colombia and Peru. And because evangelicals are based in churches, well-organized churches, evangelical political movements tend to be pretty well-organized. They have a well-organized base. In Peru, for example, the pro-family social movement is now one of the largest, most successful social movements in the entire country. So the rise of violent crime plus the rise of evangelical Christians are the dominant reasons why you see a turn to the illiberal right. Finally, it's worth adding, though, that the illiberal right in Latin America has been given a boost by the global ascent of the illiberal right, particularly Trump's victory in the United States. So illiberal right-wing leaders like Jair Bolsonaro are tightly embedded in the growing transnational far-right network that links together Trumpists, Brexiteers, the European far-right, Hungary, and Russia. And that network, the strength of that network, has emboldened the illiberal right in Latin America as well. Just to conclude, I think the ascent of the illiberal right is a threat to democracy in Latin America. illiberal politicians, whether it's Chavez on the left or Bolsonaro on the right, reject some of the core principles of democracy. They reject principles like human rights, civil liberties, and equality before the law. You simply cannot have democracy, at least not for very long, without individual rights. As we saw very clearly in Venezuela, democracy without civil liberties eventually becomes authoritarianism. For me, the nightmare model is Duterte in the Philippines. Duterte's illiberal policies, his incredibly violent policies, have generated broad public support. And that has enabled him, this broad public support has enabled him to steadily chip away at democratic institutions. That model is precisely what worried a lot of us about the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil. Bolsonaro is clearly an authoritarian figure. Again, he's embraced torture, he's embraced extrajudicial killing, he's embraced military rule. If Bolsonaro were to be successful politically, were he to succeed, he could become a model for others in Latin America, just like Brazil's 1964 military coup became a model for others in the region. And in fact, we are already seeing politicians positioning themselves to be their country's Bolsonaro. Cast in Chile, Keiko Fujimori in Peru, if she can manage to get out of jail, Now, fortunately, Bolsonaro has not been very successful. Brazil's economy is not doing very well. It's still pretty stagnant. And Bolsonaro's approval rating is stuck in the low to mid 30s. So he's not doing great. That's good news. But if Bolsonaro fails, it's good news because if Bolsonaro fails, if he does not succeed politically, if he doesn't manage to get reelected, for example, it may well help to prevent the emergence of a sort of illiberal right model. Just like Chavismo's eventual failure has helped to undermine the spread of a Bolivarian model. So champions of liberal democracy ought to root for Bolsonaro's political failure. But still, despite the fact that Bolsonaro has not done well, I worry. And I worry because basic individual rights have expanded enormously in Latin America over the last 30 or 40 years. We do not give Latin America the credit it deserves for the expansion of rights over the last 2 generations. Latin America's human rights record in the first 2 decades of the 21st century was better by far than any other period of Latin American history. There's also been a dramatic expansion of civil rights, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of association and protest. In fact, outside of Europe and North America, Latin America as a region has the best civil liberties record on earth. There's also been a dramatic and for many surprising expansion of minority rights in Latin America. Across Latin America over the last decade, we've seen new laws against domestic violence, against racial discrimination. We've seen new laws protecting indigenous minorities, and we've seen unprecedented and shocking, for those who've studied Latin America for a long time, laws protecting LGBT rights. Same-sex marriage is now legal in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and in parts of Mexico. That was unthinkable 20 years ago. It was unthinkable 10 years ago. In short, Latin America has become much more liberal over the last 30 years. The protection of human rights, civil liberties, minority rights in Latin America is more expansive and more robust than ever before in the region's history. We are now seeing a pushback against that rights expansion. That's a trend that should trouble anybody who cares about democracy in Latin America. Without a solid liberal foundation, both the quality and the stability of democracy eventually will be in peril. Let me stop there. Thank you.
All right, so we have about 15 minutes or so for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. So I'm curious what you think led to the rise of violence and crime in the region, and how much of it is the war on drugs and narcotics?
What led to the rise of violence and crime in the region? That is not my area of research, and to the extent that I can tell, even those for whom it is the area of research, is not a clear consensus. There are pretty good explanations in Central America that have to do with the end of civil wars and with what is the term for the circular migration, and particularly the sending back of many gang members from the United States to Central America. So the rise in violence in Central America, where it's the worst, is clearly related to that. The other thing is not the drug war, but the expansion of drug running, which now increasingly passes through Central America and Mexico. So those are two causes, but and the other long-term cause, I think, is inequality. I mean, across the world, there's pretty good, at least correlational evidence of a relationship between extreme inequality and levels of crime. Yes?
Why do you think that we see in the United States the mislabeling of these politicians as populists, when especially in Bolsonaro's case, I think the term fascist might be more appropriate. So why do you think that is that we see this mislabeling of these politicians?
It's a good question. Why do we see this mislabeling? First of all, there is an element of populism to a lot of these guys. Populism is a strategy. It's a strategy used by politicians usually to win elections. You appeal to the poor against a disliked and often hated elite. It's really hard to find in a democracy successful politicians who don't use at least a dose of populism. I wouldn't call Elizabeth Warren a populist. There's an element of populism to her discourse. I wouldn't call George W. Bush a populist back when he was first elected in 2000, but there was an element of populism to his discourse. Basically, politicians everywhere use it. So it's not what you see in Modi or Orban or Erdogan is not 100%. It's not completely removed from populism. There's an element of populism to it. It's just not the dominant aspect. I think it's just become a sexy term. I think a lot of it had to do with we needed a term for Trump when he got elected in 2016. Experts on American politics, both journalists and political scientists, did not really have a good label for him, did not really have a good concept to describe him. So a lot of scholars, there were tons of conferences between scholars of American politics and scholars of Latin American politics where we discussed the phenomena of populism. Populism is not entirely new in the United States. We've back to from Jennings through Huey Long through George Wallace, but it's for a couple of generations of Americans, this was pretty new stuff. And so and I think there's a big element of populism to Trump, but the term got very sexy around the rise of Trump in 2016, and it's a simple, easy term that everyone seems to recognize. Nobody knows what the hell illiberalism means, especially in the United States, where liberalism is usually kind of conflated with left of center politics. In Europe you can use the term liberalism and illiberalism and they get it, but not in the United States. So populism is just an easy term. And again, journalists and academics, the people who write articles and op-eds about populism, tend to be pretty liberal. Not always left of center, but the ones who are right of center are pretty liberal. They're all sort of center left and center right liberals, and they've just sort of taken to use the term populism for everybody they don't like. All the guys who say and do things that runs counter to their core liberal. I mean, I don't like these guys either, but I just don't think that's the best word. That's the best reason to use the concept. That's not a great answer. I don't have a great answer. Thank you. Yes.
Do you think Russia and China are like stirring the pot in Latin America? Any evidence of that? Or I guess any pro-right-wing regimes in other parts of the country?
Well, the thing about Russia, so China in particular has much greater economic power in Latin America than it ever did. The growth of China is a reality. It's a long-coming, steady, I would say inevitable process. China's economic role is night and day from where it was 30 years ago. China has not exerted a ton of political influence. China, outside of its neighborhood, doesn't care that much about who's in power. But its economic influence is growing. Russia is different. Russia doesn't have the same economic power. It doesn't have the same kind of sustainable power that China has, but it's been much more active politically. And what it's been active in is in supporting illiberals on both the right and the left. Russia loves illiberals of all kinds. They love Maduro in Venezuela, a classic example of an illiberal left. And I mean, I don't know that much about their relationship. I mean, they love Trump, right? So they are actively championing illiberals on both the left and the right. They played some role in helping to sustain the Maduro government in Venezuela. Beyond that, Russian influence is still pretty meager. What's interesting is that they're very active, very aggressive in social media, and you see them having an impact on people. Again, both the far right and the far left in Latin America. Ideas, what I would call in many cases fake news, is being pushed by the Russians, often say about the United States, is being absorbed in social media by both elements of the left and elements of the right. Yes.
Do you think AMLO in Mexico it represents an example of an illiberal leftist, or do you think he's more of a center-left?
That's the big question. AMLO. I see AMLO so far as a borderline case that could still go in either direction. AMLO is not an outsider. It's not a crazy outsider like say Chavez or Correa were. He's a long-standing politician with a pretty long record of pragmatism, including when he was mayor of Mexico City. He's a pretty pragmatic guy. But he certainly used an element of populism in his campaign, in all of his campaigns. And he's had the good fortune, which may be the misfortune of liberal democracy, of coming to power at a time when his opponents were badly weakened, badly discredited, and he won an outright majority in Congress. I would never give an outright majority in Congress or Parliament to somebody with illiberal inclinations. This is the great lesson from Hungary, and I worry a little bit about Mexico. So far, I view AMLO as a more borderline case who's ultimately more pragmatic and likely ultimately to stay within the bounds of liberal democratic institutions like the Kirchners in Argentina, who often get labeled populist and I don't think, or get labeled illiberal. And I think that they fell short of that. But it's a borderline case for sure. Yes?
So do you think the rise in crime in Latin America and almost Bolsonaro's authoritarian approach to government will lead to sectors of authoritarian rulers or regimes throughout Latin America, like per se in 1970s with Pinochet and Operation Condor?
Well, that's the danger. That's the nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario is that if civilian governments continue to fail to deliver the goods. I mean, governing Latin America is hard. I don't know how many of you have tried it. I have not, but I have friends who have. And governing Latin America is hard for a lot of reasons. Economic volatility, severe social inequality, but most importantly, governing Latin America is hard because states are pretty weak. States don't work very well. And when the state, in the sense that they're unable to collect taxes very well, they're unable to implement policies very well, whether it's building schools and hospitals or paving roads or protecting citizens from criminals. The things that states are supposed to do, that governments are supposed to do, provide social welfare, tax, provide security, uphold law and order. Governments don't do very well in Latin America. Even the best intentioned, best trained governments in Latin America don't tend to do very well because the state is weak. And so when governments fail to deliver the goods, including security to citizens over and over again, you get rising levels of dissatisfaction. And we're seeing that in Latin America. And the great danger is if citizens become convinced that no civilian government, no political party, nobody on the spectrum of the civilian political elite is capable of delivering security, that they'll turn to the military. Thus far, in most of the region, there's not much support for a return to military rule. Argentines still don't want to go back to the military. Uruguayans don't want to go to the military. There's been the level's higher in Brazil, but it's not that high. It's not that high in Chile. So it's not an imminent danger, but that's the risk. combating crime is really hard, and it's a slow process. Bringing down rates of violence from Honduran levels to Finnish levels nobody can do that overnight, and it's going to take time. And whether citizens will have the patience to allow civilian governments to do that over 10, 20, 25, 30 years is an open question. So what you lay out is the worst case scenario. I don't think it's imminent, but it's something to worry about. Yes.
Due to the fact that a lot of the destabilization of Latin American countries has led to a lot of immigrants coming to seek amnesty in the United States, what role do you think the U.S. should play in helping to stabilize that region?
Well, I would say more active role. There's not that much that the United States can do to help to address, at least rapidly, issues of violent crime in Latin America. But keeping U.S. markets open to Latin American exports is very helpful economically, which certainly helps in terms of crime. There's good evidence that closing off markets, including drug markets to the United States, leads to greater unemployment for young men who then engage in crime. So protectionism is a really bad idea if you want to combat crime and if you want to combat migration in the United States. Cutting off economic aid to Central America is a phenomenally bad idea. Not that U.S. aid to Guatemala is going to solve the problem, but certainly cutting off aid to Central American governments is not the way to. Because you're right, it's violent crime primarily that is pushing immigrants at this point to seek asylum in the United States. So again, I don't want to raise expectations. There's not a ton the United States can do, but for sure the United States, in terms of trade and in terms of economic assistance, ought to be doing everything possible. That's the best way to reduce migration flows to the United States. There's a question here, yes.
So you mentioned earlier about how the commodities, the sale of commodities really helped the Latin America, and then that kind of plateaued, and now I'm wondering, you're here in Eastern Washington, and we've got a lot of commodities that we can't sell anymore because of the tariffs. And I understand that Brazil and Russia are kind of stepping in, but I'm just wondering, this probably may get a little bit off your topic, but just like, might we start seeing South America step in more back into the commodities market? And
well, it still is, and there are a lot of disagreements among economists about whether in the long term a reliance on commodity exports is the way to go for Latin America. There are many economists who think it's not a great idea, but most Latin American economies, really almost all of them, Mexico is a big exception, but most Latin American economies rely very heavily on commodity exports. So it depends what you produce in the United States, in regions of the United States. Whether they're vulnerable to penetration by Latin American competitors. But Latin Americans are not stupid. As long as people are buying, they are going to export. And if Trump's gonna mess around and reduce our exports to Asia, you better believe anybody who can is going to step in and compete. Question is, can you export huckleberries? I never had a huckleberry before yesterday, and they're really good. I'm getting now I'm really getting outside my area of expertise.
I have been domesticated, I'm sorry.
we've got lots of garbanzo beans that you can.
The Cougar Gold, wait till you try that.
There was another question.
Just a real quick one,
Yeah.
it may not be super quick, following up from the commodity boom question that Mary was talking about there. We know that the rise of the left coincided with, or rather followed, years of austerity, IMF mandated austerity in the region. The left came into power maybe as a result, that's certainly connected. Now we're seeing this, and they were funded with the commodity boom, as you said. Is it connected then that the rise of the right is due to the slowing of the commodities boom? And if so, what should the IMF be doing to sort of counteract that it maybe didn't do in the past?
That austerity helped to fuel the rise of the left. The IMF doesn't want to return to the left, so it should learn its lesson
I don't think it's learned that lesson. I mean, look, there are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, when you run out of money, like Ecuador right now or Argentina under Macri, at some level you've got to adopt austerity, right? The IMF's right at some level, in some context. And when you there are two different ways to respond to a commodities boom. You can do it the way the Chileans and the Peruvians did it, which is make sure that your policies are sustainable. Make sure that whatever policies you adopt, you've got the money to pay for them even when the price of commodities go down. And you basically create a rainy day fund with all the massive revenue you pull in. The Peruvians and Chileans did that. The Peruvians and Chileans are doing fine fiscally right now. They got problems, but they're fiscally okay. Or you could do it the Argentine way, which is spend like there's no tomorrow, pretend the commodities boom is going to last forever, and then get a huge hangover when the price of commodities goes down. When you're Argentina, you have to, at some level, tighten the belt. It's not just the IMF that thinks that. Now, there are a whole slew of other policies that the IMF pushed in the 90s that could be rethought. But basic austerity, when you're in a position like Argentina today or Ecuador today, is hard to avoid.
Okay, I'm afraid our time is up. Let me remind you before I ask you to join me in thanking our guest that we don't have any events next week. We have a week off, but then after that we have two events coming up. The 21st is our next event. That's on Brexit. That'll be noon here. And then on the 24th we have another event with the chair of the National Endowment of Humanities. That'll be here at noon as well. Let me also remind you, if you're here for a class, there'll be some sign-up sheets out in the foyer. Now you see why I was so excited when Professor Levitsky agreed to come and visit us at WSU. Join me now in thanking him for a really great presentation.